Hello once again, everyone. So I had a question branching off of the Messer vid I did earlier this week, which was talking about half sword and two-handing the Messer in general. So let's go over that. So first and foremost, the biggest question is what is the difference in half swording with a Messer versus half swording with a longsword? So really, the easiest way to say that is going to be it's about length. If I put myself in my normal half sword position, which is about my shoulder length, I have approximately a buck knife's worth of action on either end. Right, I have a little bit more toward my tip than I do in regards to my pommel. Some Messer grips are going to be a little longer though. Now, versus if I was holding a longsword in that same way, I'd have about double on either side. Length of lever means longer hook, which means I can do certain things a little bit easier, and so I don't necessarily need to get as close. Usually the actions are going to be a little simpler though because of that. So with longer weapon, sure, it means more reach and more leverage, but it also tends to indicate more distance, as once I get that lever in there, I don't have to bring myself closer to exploit it, since the lever itself is making up for that. Versus Messer, a lot of the time when I close in, I'm going to have to bring myself much closer to my opponent. Since the lever is shorter, I need to compensate with the rest of my body. So, the other thing to consider when it comes to half swording with the Messer is that because we are going to bring ourselves closer, more often than not, part of your action is going to be hooking and usually pinning an arm, either an arm or their blade, underneath your own arm or entrapping it in some way, so that way they can't use it. There are various instances of this, and if you'd like to see a lot of them showcased, they tend to be the ones that are put to film. A lot of the blade work and stuff that I talked about in the last Messer video, they don't really get the spotlight because they don't look as exciting as people, walking up, ripping down, striking someone with a pommel, etc. It's not quite as flashy. So there's a bunch of different instances in which you can look that up, but usually these are going to enter off of an Entrustau or something similar. Entrustau's, which is basically a Zwerkau, is great for entering into grappling for two reasons. Number one, it very quickly causes my opponent to block in a not terribly good manner, since if they try to reach out and catch it, it can still reach through, since their blade will end up close to my hilt. That can wrap around. Not to mention I can adjust its height very easily. I can strike low or high. I can even strike over the top. Furthermore, the best way to really block it is going to be to bring your sword over in such a way where your arm is now relatively extended and out in front of you, which makes you particularly susceptible for being grabbed. It's basically like trying to start a grappling match by walking out like this, right? It's just asking for someone to take your hand and take that away from you. So, as such, a majority of actions will be you'll Entrustau on this side to cause them to block, and then either you will enter from there, or alternatively, in the course of you launching your second Entrustau, which brings you to the other side, as most Zwerks do, you can now enter in for the half sword or a variety of grappling actions. Now, an important thing to remember about grappling at the body when you have to do with swords is there are two lines. There's the inside line and the outside line, and it's dependent upon my sword, right? So if you want to grapple to the inside, what's usually going to happen is you're going to want to lock this behind me, right? So lock this up behind your arm or something along those lines, and they'll want to take me that way, as that's where I'm vulnerable to being thrown, versus I have pressure in this regard, and I will seek to take you the same way. So these would be throws like the hips and knees, otherwise known as osotogari. These would be throws like inner inside hooks or things of that nature. You can also, of course, just drag the arm down, and there is also several instances, especially in Lekukner, where you will draw the arm out and then basically sit onto it, but we'll get back to that again in a moment. On the outside, so this line, generally you're not going to be throwing me. What you're going to often end up doing is either taking my sword away, arm barring me, or collapsing my structure. You will still have throws that put me onto my back, but those involve you getting very close. So there's kind of two distances on this side. This side, there is, of course, you opening me up and then using your sword to strike. So that would be those arm wraps we talked about last time. So I use the bogan, I grab the arm, and now I'm just at distance to either thrust, cut, or thrust. all those great stuff. Then you can start looking into, the fancy stuff, like locking somebody up. Anyway, though, or there's covering with the intent express purpose of throwing. On this side, same idea, except when you stay out at this distance, you have the option of stabbing, of course. You can hook the arm and pull it down. You can sit through into a falling armbar, which is particularly nasty. But if you step up closer to the person, so that would mean your left foot is going to be basically right here behind me. We're going to be hip to hip, and we're basically going to be facing the same direction. That's where you're getting things like the collar throw. You can pick a leg, something along those lines. Those will be throws that put me onto my back. You're never really going to get instances where you throw me purely forward. Not that it can't happen, but that requires some struggle, and that will be, at that point, that's not necessarily Messer-specific action so much as it is wrestling experience. But anyway, so, as such, a lot of the times where you're going to see half-sword used is going to, like I said, you'll either do this with the Entrustau, you'll grab, and then you'll enter into something. So I can, for example, grab. There are instances where you will grab, pull down, then I can focus on the arm, or something along those lines. There are even instances where I will strike in, ditch my sword entirely to put two hands on you, things along those lines. But usually, the ones that end in half-sword are going to be Entrustau 1, Entrustau 2, where now we're going to come over, rather than just striking out, we're going to fold this over into the Gewehrknopf, the armed hand / half-sword position. From here we can thrust, we can wrestle, we can pommel, we can hook, all those great things. Another instance in which you will often find entering into the half-sword comes up is going to be either someone's being particularly cheeky and brave, and I recommend that if you want to use the half-sword as a block, don't go to the half-sword first, then try to block. What you want to do is you want to approach low, take yourself one extra step forward, right, with my sword completely low, so that even if it's someone who knows what's coming, it's too juicy not to take. Because the little voice in the back of their head goes, oh, he's probably trying to block. He's going to try and do the half-sword block. But the other little voice in the back of their head goes, I'm faster than him, right? And it works. It works surprisingly well. So like I said, you come down low, you take that extra step forward, then you go up into the half-sword to catch a cut, and from there you can do whatever you need to do. That's one instance, and I do that mostly with longsword, but it does still work with Messer. The other time you'll see it is often when you are deflecting against cuts coming around. So for example, we push them off to the side, they start coming around, or even up from below. We are taught to step up with them, catch by guarding ourselves in basically a low steer. My thumb is on the blade, my noggle's to the outside, all lessons we learned last time. And from here, you can either just thrust from here, or you'll see sometimes people go into the half-sword. Or alternatively, since I was the one that just struck up, if I was coming around, I see that catch that points at my stomach, or it was coming from below, a great thing for me to do is to go to the half-sword to deflect that and come back in. So, these are some situations in which you end up in half-sword fights. But the majority of the time, it's going to be the speed, the surprise, the violence of action, the choosing to come in with something that gets them moving, then taking a tempo of, a big tempo of taking off to move into the half-sword / into a wrestling position. But, like I said, most of the actions end up being relatively close range, and it's all a game of hooking, right? Get this hooked over their wrist, pull that back, get the point in their face. Get this hooked over their wrist, pull it around, see if you can get the sword out of their hand, or set up for a throw, or something along those lines, or pommel. And escaping from fights like that generally boils down to keep control of your own wrist. Don't let it get pulled away from you. Don't let it get trapped downward. And there's a bunch of different specific instances that you can study into. Some general ones that I advise if you want to use the half-sword in Messer and don't want to read a ton of techniques yet, so you just want one that works instantaneously, would again just be the Entrustau, right? You're just going to strike around, thrust. Very quick, very snappy, relatively hard to parry as well, because even if they do bring their sword around to catch this, once that makes contact, your hand's reinforcing, you'll go through that block. Another instance that you can do, again, that works very well is low, catch, straight in. Works fantastic. Those two, doesn't require a ton of practice, just requires some encouragement. Now, another question that I had was, putting two hands on the sword in other ways. There are some instances in which it is shown / I will personally just go ahead and put my hand on the back of the spine. This is usually going to be a reinforcement. So for example, one of my personal favorites is I will catch, I'll push forward and hook, and as I am pulling down, if I don't wish to grab them bodily, where they're trying to run away from me and I don't get the chance, I'll put my hand on the back of that blade to pull down with a little more force. I'm not quite in the full half sword because I don't need to be. And from there I get just a little bit added to it, and I can deliver a quick thrust following it. There are other situations in which I will come around and cut the arm, or even one in which I'll hit the head with the short edge, then push down off of their head. So I'm binding on their face, a fun Lignitzer term, to prevent their arm from coming back against me. In that instance, sometimes I will put my hand here as well to really jam them. So that's an instance which I'm not quite half swording, but I am putting two hands on the blade. We do also get shown striking with the other end. It does still have a Mordschlag. It has a particularly hilarious Mordschlag, because what you essentially do is you Entrustau, you switch, you are going to strike 1, strike 2, strike 3. So that's meant to be basically just a 3-hit combo. You hit them in the face, you hit them in the gut, and then as they're bending over, you hit them in the head. Again, it's two hands on the sword. Personally, I think that you probably never need to hit them more than once, but that is what is described and what is shown. Now, in regards to putting two hands on it in like a sword grip, that does come up. So, canonically, in the Kukner, there is one depiction of a guy doing that, and the way he does it is a very smart one, and one that I wish I'd learned earlier, and it's very important to learn both for Messer and for longsword. So, what happens is, we end up where he has got his left hand like that, right? So he's grabbed hold of my wrist and is preventing me from doing anything. Before he can come in with the rest of his grappling action, and this is usually described as I am left foot forward, so he's come up at me, I'm going to put my left hand underneath and grab hold of my own grip to assist, and I am going to push down hard while pulling, and at the same time step back with my left leg to deliver a cut. So what I'm essentially doing here is I'm locked up, I'm in a bad way, he's grabbed my arm, I go, oh no, grab, push, right? And that's all it's meant to be, is just push down. And because of where the sword will be, you'll usually crack him in the head, not necessarily terribly hard, but from there, once you land, it's that stepping back that's allowing you to prevent from being pulled, and you are also delivering a slice. So it's a very useful escape, and like I said, it's great for longsword because eventually I'll put it on the channel, but one of the most common grips you will see is you'll wrap somebody's arm or something along those lines, you'll go for a pommel, and they'll stop that arm right there. If you don't want to transition into the rest of wrestling, where someone has stopped your arm in general, with a longsword especially, it's super easy to grab hold of your own grip and then deliver a cut. So bear that in mind. Now that's the only canonical, as far as I know, canonical instance of putting two hands on the Messer like that. We do see use of Messers in two hands. Those are a little bit different though. So we see, for example, it's usually called the Kriegsmesser. Again, that's kind of an anachronistic term. And there's also speculation as to whether or not they were more longsword size, or even more this size but with longer handles. And it could just be, okay, here's my Messer that I can use one-handed and can use two-handed. Which, to be fair, my personal preference for a longsword is about there, a little more on the two-handed side. For a Messer, again, a little more on the one-handed side. So it's debatable as to whether or not we have that instance, as to which, is it a weapon that is purely meant to be used in two hands that's basically just a big Messer? Or is it a, one-handed Messer with a little extra beef to it that we can use in two hands, as we don't have an official source on using Kriegsmesser. But, so bear that in mind. However, that doesn't mean that you can't use two hands on your Messer as is. One of my guys, Randy, is particularly being a little bit infamous for it. He will throw out a Zorn, and he'll go ahead and Zorn either with the one hand, or he'll add in that second hand into it, which adds a lot of pressure. He and I actually did this to each other at the exact same time, and it was really funny how interesting it felt. But either way, so boom, Because what that does is normally when we come into a bind, as you've seen, I do have power here, but I don't necessarily have as much leverage as I normally would. With 2 hands on the blade, I just have more leverage. It's double the hands. So, against a one-handed person, he comes in and then will execute a wind, but with 2 hands. Now, you need to learn how to wind with 1 hand or 2 hands, but I will not say that a wind with 2 hands is not more powerful, especially if you've only got 1 hand on the blade. So that is an instance in which someone I know has been successfully doing so. Other instances in which that might be useful, I can't really say. But certainly Randy has been making it work, and thus far no one has, shut it down. I have some ideas for how to shut it down, certainly, but in general, I won't put those because he watches these videos and I want to use them on him. But in general, there aren't a ton of instances in which you might put 2 hands on it, except for maybe, here and there, little things. And usually if that's the option available, you might as well go to half sword. So either way, that's just a general little overview of some instances in which you might put your other hand on your messer. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The biggest thing to remember is to, one, depending upon what source you're studying, you're probably going to study Lekukner at some point or another because he is really the granddaddy of all, well, he's not the granddaddy of all Messer, but he is the big source on Messer, and it is quite an endeavor to learn him. But he goes over a lot of different instances in which that comes up. Another thing to consider is just any wrestling experience you have, or any half-swording experience you have from other things, can be transferred into Messer pretty easily. Vice versa, to an extent as well. And the only other instance that really stands out that I didn't talk about is dropping your own messer to put just 2 hands on the person. That can also sometimes be you're dropping your own messer to put 2 hands on their messer and take it away, but I'll save that for another time. Overall, though, experiment with it, see what works, but end of the day, stick to the basics, and they'll take you pretty far. It's only when you start trying to force things like this that you're gonna probably get schooled. So, otherwise, though, just a little fun video after a question prompt, and we will go over some other techniques another time.